wherever you are. We've been on quite the cold streak here.
Yep.
That said, we're excited to jump in with the first podcast. We got another great guest lined up here today. And we'll be setting the stage as we move towards some fun events like John Howard Week, and we'll talk about a few other things coming up. But as always, I'm Josh Constantinou, hosting here as the Access Coordinator for the John Howard Society.
And I'm Conor Mullin, President of the Board of Directors of John Howard PEI.
And we've got our guest, Shawn. Shawn, you want to introduce yourself for us there?
Yeah, hi, everybody. My name is Shawn Fraser. I'm the CEO of the John Howard Society of Saskatchewan. And I'd also like to report that it is this cold out here. The other day, it was with the wind chill, it was minus 33. And I looked it up on Mars. Mars was hoping to hit a high of minus 35. So almost as cold in Saskatchewan as it is in Mars.
Wow. Monday, it was, you've got us beat. Yeah. I think we were minus 27 at our worst. Yeah. So, yeah. Oh. And it's warmed up a little bit today. It's only minus 10 now. So.
Yeah, well, minus 27, you can get your shorts out in Saskatchewan. So, yeah, good for
you. Sounds like we shouldn't be complaining over here.
No, I'm actually surprised you're not wearing shorts today, Josh.
Yeah, well, the streak's got to end at some point, and it's been cold.
There you
go. Thanks for joining us here, Shawn. We'll certainly be excited to learn some more about what's going on there. As always, sort of reminders for logistically, you can find us on the John Howard Society by PEI YouTube channel, on our social media, and on our website. So feel free to tune into any of those mechanisms to find the podcast. Conor, do you want to start us off with any board updates or anything that's going on? I know you had your first board meeting of the year a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'd mentioned this the last time, but we have a number of new board members, which is really exciting. Some people with some different backgrounds and experiences that they're bringing to the table, which has been great so far. And so with the kind of the new board members in mind, we're engaging in some discussion and hopefully some movement forward on a couple of big projects. One is looking into the establishment of a social enterprise within the John Howard Society of PEI. So for those that don't know, a social enterprise is essentially a business that's operated within a nonprofit organization. There are a couple of John Howard societies across Canada that operate, that have some social enterprises, and a couple of other organizations on PEI have social enterprises, but that's something we're looking at getting into. So we'll be having some pretty significant discussion around that at our next board meeting. We're also looking at something that I think would be really exciting and has been tried before on PEI unsuccessfully. Would be to have some partnership with the private sector and establish a halfway house for inmates on parole from federal correctional facilities. We have there are a number of people from Prince Edward Island serving federal sentences who are going to be released, and those that are released at this time unfortunately can't come home because there's nowhere to place them on supervision. We're the only province of PEI without any type of halfway house or transitional housing. So I say it would be great if we could establish one here. It's been proposed in the past, and there's been some pretty significant community pushback, which is not uncommon for this type of project.
Sure.
But we've got a potential private sector partner who's got a lot of experience in this area and establishing and running transitional housing in other provinces in Atlantic Canada. So again, that's something we'll be having some pretty significant discussion on at our next board meeting, and hopefully be moving forward with, because I say there's a definite need for it here. On top of that, and something Josh, I know you're involved in, we talked about it quite a bit of time, was the point in time count for homelessness.
Yes.
And I understand the data has finally been processed. And tabulated. It hasn't been released yet. I haven't seen the numbers, but I do understand that the government has them all, and they're
not yet.
No, the government doesn't have them yet. Okay, sorry. So the data processing's done, but now those numbers have to go to the government, and then the government.
Government of Canada has.
Government of Canada. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So they go to
too many governments.
They go to the government of Canada, and then the government of Canada will kind of decide when and how they're released. So. That may be coming soon. So certainly that's something that when it is released, that I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion about, and collaboration with government and other organizations to address that issue. So that's going to be very exciting for that to be done. We're also in the works of establishing at the board of directors a DEI workshop, diversity, equity, and inclusion, for all of our board members, and maybe something that we organize for staff as well. This is something we've talked about at the John Howard Society of Canada level for a long time, making sure that the organization is understanding and responsive to kind of the changing face of Canadian society and the changing face of the clientele that we serve. Yes. Making sure that we are a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization. We've taken some steps towards that at our local level here. We have a diversity, equity, and inclusion statement. We have an employment equity strategy, and we have done like a sort of a small workshop before, but we want to do kind of a larger scale one to really kind of address these issues. And some members of our board have agreed to take on sort of looking at all of the organization's policies through a DEI lens and see if we need to change any of our policies to kind of foster that inclusive environment that we want to create and maintain here. So those are a couple of the kind of the big things happening from the board level right now.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think I know the social enterprise and the halfway house has been sort of percolating for a while now.
Yeah, they're big undertakings and not something that we want to jump into lightly. So I say, we've had some pretty significant kind of behind the scenes discussions, Keith, our executive director, and I, and looked at models from other provinces, what works, what doesn't work, looked at what other organizations here do. And say finally, I think we're ready to bring it to the larger board for discussion. And like I say, hopefully we'll be moving forward on those projects. But it's at the very least, it's going to be a good discussion.
Awesome. Yeah, exciting to see where those go. And like you said, certainly with the halfway house, that's a huge need, and the corrections spot.
Oh, hello.
Our staff members, Tanner, was over at Renews at a little conference they had there in the recent past, and that was one of his takeaways from people he talked to, was that there's a real need for a halfway house on PEI. So
yeah, exciting stuff. Program wise, a lot of things are just sort of hitting the ground after a bit of a holiday break. All of our offices were closed, so CRA tax clinics that have been going on are continuing to get planned, but we're kind of in the midst now of shifting into actual tax season.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to become more the focus point from now till kind of April, May.
Sure.
Is actually getting people's taxes done and getting those prepared. So, we've got the volunteer tax program that's free for individuals in the community to come in. I think it's good for people to know that they don't have to be John Howard clients.
Yep, absolutely.
So anyone as long as they sort of meet the sort of quote unquote low income threshold, which is pretty high threshold these days.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
I think even middle class is more in the low income side now relative to cost of living. So basically a way to say we don't turn very many people away.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's a great thing. Like we've talked about, I know we've helped, in the past, 300, and then next year is 400 people, and the number seems to keep climbing. So obviously there's a real need for it, and there's a real significant benefit for people that we're able to help file tax returns every year. Access to benefits and other things like that. And sometimes when someone hasn't filed taxes in a long time, there can be quite a bit of back pay of benefits and other things of that nature. So there's a real tangible benefit. So encourage anyone who's listening, if you haven't done your taxes, or someone who maybe needs some help with that, send them our way, and we're absolutely happy to help anyone.
Exactly. Yep. Outside of that, you touched a bit on the point in time count. So as you said, we've been analyzing the data, we've gone through it. We've got kind of some initial impressions that we've gotten a chance to put together in a report. So we're waiting to put that through the process and get that published. I think the timeline's probably looking somewhere from, mid-March to mid-April, somewhere in that area. But I know, I've had a lot of community partners, government partners asking, what's that look like? What's the information? What are the takeaways? So
Same here. I've had quite a number of people asking, what's the final number here, and the media's reached out and said, hey, let us know when these numbers are released, and we'll want to talk about them.
For
So
sure.
there's a lot of interest
Yes.
in this data.
Yeah, I think that we'll have a pretty captive audience shortly after that report's, or maybe even immediately after that report's released. Right?
Yep.
So yeah, that'll certainly be a hot topic coming up, and then we've got John Howard Week coming up.
That's right. Yeah, John Howard Society Week is coming up in early March.
Yeah, March 3rd to 7th, I think, off the top of my head. Or February, yeah, March. Where are we now? Yeah, 3rd to 7th.
March 3rd to 7th, yeah. So we're going to be doing a podcast every day, a little bit of a lunch and learn on that.
Yeah.
And we're in the process of lining up some pretty exciting guests. Going to be some more guests from across Canada, and some guests with some international perspectives as well. So it's going to be very interesting. So certainly encourage everyone to tune in for John Howard Society Week.
Yeah, and this will be the last podcast before then.
Yeah.
But we'll certainly be sharing information about it on social media and our website.
Excellent.
All right. Anything else before we turn it over to Shawn?
No, I think that's it. I think we're all we're very excited that Shawn's here with us today, and I can't wait to hear about everything. I know of a couple of things going on in Saskatchewan, so I'm excited to hear everything from Shawn, how things are going and what's going on over there.
All right, Shawn, the floor is yours. Take it away.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yes, we
sounds
can.
great.
Okay, excellent. You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. I've just put my headphones in here, so just want to make sure. So hi, everybody. Again, my name is Shawn Fraser. I'm the CEO of the John Howard Society of Saskatchewan. I've been in this role for almost 6 years now, which in the timescale of the John Howard Saskatchewan is just like a very short chapter. We're actually celebrating 67 years this summer. So John Howard Society of Saskatchewan's been around doing good work for a long time. I think our traditional mandates, the core mandate is similar to most of those other John Howard societies across Canada, and a few John Howard organizations like outside of Canada as well. But we work with traditionally men coming out of custody. Today, the work of the John Howard Society is much broader than that. Again, at its core, we still work with men coming out of custody, but on top of that, we also offer youth housing. So we have 8 youth homes across Saskatchewan. 7 of those funded through the Ministry of Social Service. And one of them is a place called Lulu's Lodge, which is actually Saskatchewan's first LGBTQ2S plus focused youth home that we started in 2018. We saw a need. About a third of homeless youth in Canada identify as being from that community. So we saw that need at our door, and we just decided to go ahead and start a home to fill that gap. Since that time, that program has blossomed into a house that we now own, and some close to core funding. I'll say a few different sources that now it has a proper budget versus just people running off the side of their desk. We also are the partner with the province of Saskatchewan for Saskatchewan's integrated youth services model, which we call home base here. There's similar models in many other provinces across Canada. And that program is really focused on youth mental health needs. So I think youth mental health is as old as time, but it's only recently that we've kind of started naming it. And the health authority in Saskatchewan has realized that they have the resources, but they don't necessarily have the connections with youth in the community. So they went through a process to hire a backbone agency. We applied for that process, and we were a successful candidate. So we act as sort of the last link of the bureaucracy for delivering that funding. And then we have a committee that oversees where that funding goes, and we fund 4 other partner organizations across Saskatchewan to operate youth mental health drop-ins. So picture like an emergency room. Well, not quite an emergency room. Picture a drop-in space that has a nurse and a ping pong table. It's like a safe place for youth to hang out, but it also has access to those youth mental health resources that people might not want to go, to traditional places to find. I often think, like, if I or someone I loved was facing a mental health crisis, probably the last place on earth I'd want to go is the emergency room. So this is sort of an alternative to that. You can come to one of these drop-in spaces. It's cool. It's comfortable. It's the right space for youth, and we can connect you with a counselor. We can connect you with a nurse. Some of our spaces have doctors on site. You can actually book a doctor's visit, et cetera. So that's pretty exciting work. So yeah, we talk about youth housing. We talk about youth mental health. We also have gotten into adult housing in the last few years. So we now operate adult homes in the 4 communities we operate out of, which is Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and Regina, Saskatchewan. And then sort of some of that core work, we do the fine options program. So if you get a fine, like a traffic violation or whatever, and you can't or you don't want to pay it off, you can come to us. We'll connect you with another nonprofit in the community where you can volunteer it off at minimum wage rates. You just work it down, and we kind of facilitate that. We have some money through the federal government right now to do a record suspension program. I'm not sure if John Howard's doing that in Prince Edward Island, but if people need help with the record suspension, we can help you work your way through that process. We also have a program that is adults reintegrating into community, which is just as it sounds. We work with adult males predominantly to, as they're coming out of provincial correctional institutions. A couple months out, we'll meet with them, sort of see what they need, and sort of just help with that transition back into society. We also have some funding through the Law Foundation of Saskatchewan to have a lawyer on staff. And actually, we just are about next month, we're going to be joined by a second lawyer. And our first lawyer and soon to be our second lawyer, we'll see what her interests and skill sets are exactly when she gets here and sort of tailor her position a bit to what she's strong at. But our first lawyer, who we've had on staff for about 5 years, he's predominantly involved with prison disciplinary cases. So if you get in a fight in prison, you're allowed to have representation. A lot of people don't because they can't afford it, but you're allowed to have representation. So predominantly our lawyer, that's what he does, is he goes in and he represents clients when there's an internal prison disciplinary procedure. We also get involved in some other work. Some of you might have heard in the news this fall, the John Howard Society of Saskatchewan actually took the governor of Saskatchewan to court, and it ended up going all the way to Supreme Court. I think it was back in November. So our lawyer got to go stand before the judges out in Ottawa and argue a case. And what we were talking about was the burden of proof when it comes to those prison disciplinary cases. So, in Canadian society as a whole, we would expect that you're innocent until you're proven guilty. In prison, though, it's kind of based in provincial institutions, many provincial institutions, it's based on a balance of probabilities. So again, if Josh and I were to get in a fight, and it seemed that Josh was likely the guy that started it, he could be punished for that. And we argued that, well, in a Canadian context, you're innocent until you're proven guilty. So you should have hard proof to punish someone. We lost that argument at the provincial court. We lost that at the provincial court of appeals, but then we submitted it to the Supreme Court and they considered it. So we hope sometime later this calendar year to hear back. And we hope it's an example of the John Howard Society of Saskatchewan actually having an influence on important Canadian laws. So I don't know. It's a busy place, to say the least. We have I mentioned 4 offices. We've got a budget this year of around $17 million. We've got 180 employees, more than 180 employees across the province, and there's always something new at the John Howard Society of Saskatchewan.
Wow. That is very impressive, and great programs that you're offering there, Shawn. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that Supreme Court of Canada decision. When I first heard that you guys had this lawyer who was doing these disciplinary hearings, I was very excited, and I spoke to Keith, our executive director here, and said we should try and do something like that as well here, because the outcome of a disciplinary hearing can have some pretty significant consequences. It can. Somebody's found guilty, like you say, of starting a fight or something else, they can lose their liberty even more than they already do in jail. They can be placed in lockup or segregation. They can lose what little privileges they have. It can cut their earned remission time short, meaning, when people are serving a provincial sentence, normally they only serve about 2/3 of whatever they're sentenced to if they're with good behavior. But if they start getting disciplinary infractions, they can lose that and wind up spending more time in custody than they otherwise would. So to have proper representation at these hearings is very good, and sometimes even just having a lawyer in the room kind of makes people sit up a little straighter and take things a little more seriously, which maybe they wouldn't otherwise. So it's hugely important. Now, unfortunately, we reached out to the correctional center here and they kind of shut us down immediately, said they had no interest in that. They thought it would slow things down too much. Because they generally get through their hearings pretty quickly, which makes me a little nervous because it makes me think if they're rushing through them that quickly, they're probably not giving due process to the inmates. But we're hoping that with a successful outcome at the Supreme Court of Canada, we can come back to the correctional center here and say, look, you have a duty to provide, to establish proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and that's going to require proper representation and things of that nature. So I'm really looking forward to the outcome of that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. A couple of things you brought up, I'll comment on. One, you nailed an important piece that really what's at stake for people in internal disciplinary matters is things that are already within the bounds of their sentence. This was the province's counter argument that we're not talking about extending someone's sentence, right? They've already been sentenced to an amount of time, and they might lose canteen, they might lose time in the yard, they might lose earn time, like to be released, serve their sentence in community. But we're not extending their sentence, so it shouldn't apply. Again, we hope that Supreme Court will not see it through that lens. They'll see that this has a real impact on people's health and well-being. And I'll also say, you're talking about some resistance. Certainly, we've run into that along the way. Something I'm really happy to report is that generally I feel we have a really respectful and good working relationship with those institutions, because once that position, that work is in place, people can see that actually, this isn't just about prisoners, right? This is about the climate in prison, about the environment in prison, which, if it's handled correctly, prisons are a very stressful place to be. But that's not only for the prisoners, right? Like for the guards too. It's a very stressful working environment. And if we can have a little more order and a little clearer rules for everybody, it doesn't just benefit people that are there because they have to be. It benefits people there because they work there too. So. Again, we ran into some of those exact same arguments I think you're laying out when we started, like, oh, what's this going to be? And are we giving, empowering people that are supposed to be in here because they're being punished? And of course, there's a little bit of that. We're trying to empower people because we're all kind of Canadians. We're all citizens here. But ultimately, I think we've seen the fruit of it mean that just kind of better for everybody in the system.
Yeah, no, and I think you're absolutely right. Like you say, the way that I think we have to maybe try and approach them again, say, if we can get this going, is say this isn't just about the inmates, right? You say it's about creating a better environment for everybody, and as you say, the successful outcomes there, and using Saskatchewan as an example, hopefully that can trickle down to the managerial staff at the correctional center here, and we will eventually be able to get a program like that going here, because I think it is so important, because like you say, we're all Canadian citizens, whether we're in or out of jail, and the charter and the rights that all Canadian citizens have, it doesn't stop at the walls of a jail. You still have those rights while inside, and that needs to be respected, because there are still, people do still have interest in what little liberty they can have in jail, and you can take an already stressful, difficult situation for somebody and make it almost inhumane by taking away what little rights and privileges they do still have.
Sure. Yeah, if I can just ramble for a bit, is that all right with you guys?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll say that I'm not new to the nonprofit sector, but this job was sort of my entry into the kind of justice lens on the nonprofit sector. I've worked in the homeless sector and a few other pieces that are nonprofit and charitable, but something I've noticed in the last coming up 6 years in this job is that there's just so many issues when it comes to justice that are so divisive. There's so many different views that are core, reasonable, well thought out views that are really different from each other. What is the role of prison? Is it just to punish people? Is it to actually reform people? Is it somewhere in the middle? And unfortunately, some of those views, I say unfortunately, I think unfortunately, some of those views, they're just never going to be changed. A lot of them have to do with how we were raised. Like imagine how many different parenting styles are out there, right? So if you were raised in a household where things are pretty black and white, there's good and bad people in the world, there's like strict lines, probably you're going to carry that through right to your adult life. And if you're raised in a household that's maybe doesn't quite see the world like that, that there's a lot of gray in the world, and that, well, if we make a mistake, we try to learn from it, and that sort of thing. Probably going to carry those views too, So I think there's so many issues in the justice sector that they have been argued about for a long time. They're argued about now, and if you were to come back, drop into Saskatchewan or PI or wherever, 200 years from now, we're still going to be arguing about them. But then there's a few of these issues that actually everyone can agree on, and one of those is that when people leave prison, they shouldn't come back. Like, tell me, I'm really talking about recidivism, and I don't want to be too all over the map here, but just bringing our conversation about like kind of the role of like what prison is. I think there actually is role in a Canadian society that, it's hard to argue that part of a prison sentence is it's punishment. It's you've done something wrong, you've been caught, and this is your due, what you're due for. But I think you also have to argue that if we're not having some reformative lens on it, like what's the point? And the cost of that is that you have people that, as we have now in lots of cases, that they leave the prison system, they come back, they leave the system, they come back, they leave the system, they come back, and every time they've gone, they've committed a crime. So beyond the cost of like being in prison and all of that, there's all these crimes committed in the meantime. So I think, at the end of the day, a lot of these arguments to me come back to what can we do about recidivism? It's like hard to stop a crime from happening the first time. It's not impossible. There's ways you can do it. There's investments in some of those core upstream things like education and poverty and housing and all these things. Some people argue that if you just have more police out there, you can stop it. But ultimately, where we have a real chance is with recidivism. When people are in the system, they're with us, they're not doing much inside. If we can get those people, like find a way to connect with those people, it doesn't mean there'll never be another crime committed, but if we can kind of work through with what they need and help them understand what's going on and get those resources in place that help lead to the crime in the first place. Again, you're not going to reduce everything, but there's so many crimes that we can just stop from happening in the first place, and a lot of that, sorry, I'm taking a real roundabout way here, guys, but a lot of that comes back to what we're talking about is that people's relationship with the system when they're inside, it has to be one that allows for some growth and understanding and some connection and understanding why you're in there and what you can do to not get out. And this legal piece we're talking about, it seems like a small thing, but actually spending your time in prison where it's like guards versus inmates, A, it's not good for the guards, and B, you end up with inmates that leave hating the state, and maybe I would argue, some people might not, but I would argue sometimes with good reason, because you've just spent years with a boot on your neck, so yeah, I think that's a lot about what this comes down to in the end, is like trying to find ways to reduce recidivism. I hope maybe this is a good segue, unless you guys have a list of questions you want to get through, but I'm hoping today we can talk a little bit about the federal framework to reduce recidivism, which we'll see with all the federal politics going on right now, but we're supposed to hear about this spring, sort of a full framework, what that's going to look like. And yeah, I'm in a world full of weird, interesting news right now, especially this week, man. Oh man, what a week for news. The federal framework to reduce recidivism is one thing that sticks out to me as like a little glimmer of hope that Canada, we can actually get our act together and make some real inroads on some issues that will have some big impacts, not only for people that are in prison and for those of us that have a soft spot, is that a bleeding heart? I don't know what people like to call it, because we care about people like that, or in many cases we're related to people like that, or we know those people, we're friends with them, they're our loved ones, whatever. I think for every one of the thousands of inmates in Canada, every one of those people has a network of people that are missing somebody. Every one of those people have parents and extended families and neighbors and friends usually, and all that stuff. So not only for people that have a soft spot for prisoners for whatever reasons that is, but also for people that want to be hard on crime, because those are the same things. Actually, I think that this is where it all comes together, is if we can reduce recidivism, not only are we helping build a more just, humane society, but we're also making a safer society. So I don't know, guys, that was, how much, are we out of time yet? I've just been rambling here, so please tell me back.
No, good. No, very good. But yeah, Shawn, I'd be very happy to talk about the federal framework to reduce recidivism. That's something that we've been talking about a lot at the John Howard Society, at the John Howard Society of Canada level. And I know there's a kind of a steering committee for the John Howard. Are you on that?
I'll have to check. I guess I've been, all of the provincial CEOs and EDs have been a bit involved with that, talking about, we actually came together in Newfoundland, I guess, 2 years ago,
yeah,
to sort of talk about like what role can the John Howard Societies of Canada, across Canada, have in framing this, because it's a really unique opportunity, and it's something that hasn't actually come around before in this context. So yeah, certainly. I don't think I'm on the official steering committee per se, but I'll say all of us, like, it's an ongoing conversation every time we meet from across our federation. We're always talking about it for the last couple of years here.
Yeah, and to say it is a very unique opportunity and something that I think the John Howard Society is well situated to help implement. And you would kind of mention sort of we'll see where it goes with the federal, kind of with the potential change in the air in federal politics. But one thing that at least gives me some hope in that regard is that the federal framework is something that was introduced by a conservative
that's right.
backbencher MP. So even if the Conservative Party takes power in Canada and they sort of have the historic kind of tough on crime perspective, and Pierre Poilievre seems to be no different in that regard, that this is potentially not something they can kind of claw back or turn their back on, given that it was introduced by their party. So
sure. You mentioned something there, tough on crime. Here's an interesting thing is that I actually would like to argue we're all tough on crime. Like, show me someone who's doesn't want to be tough on crime. Tough on criminals, that's a different thing, right?
Yeah.
Because some people feel that the harder you are on criminals, the less likely they are to offend or reoffend. And some people feel, well, actually, that's not actually usually how crime works. Usually if someone's about to, I'll say rob a bank to be token, I don't fill in the crime. Usually it's not a calculation of like, well, I get 8 years for this or I get 10. That's not really the drivers of crime. The drivers of crime are, two things. It's desperation and it's opportunity. Almost all crime, not all crime. There's definitely, other, domestic violence or some other crimes. I don't want to paint everything as the same. There's different motivations for different things, but for the most part, that's where crime happens, is at the corner of desperation and opportunity.
Yeah, no, and you're quite right, and I think that's actually a pretty good point. You say, yeah, the federal framework, and I think the work of the John Howard Society is tough on crime, but we would potentially differentiate ourselves from the more traditional tough on crime approach that we see tough on crime as not being tough on criminals, but I'd say being tough on those conditions that you say lead people to that corner where crime 9 times out of 10 happens.
Yeah, the term tough on crime has kind of been co-opted to mean tough on criminals, but I think that's it's kind of been co-opted because it's two different. Again, we're all tough on crime. It's just, how do we get there? There's many different opinions about that.
For sure. Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the framework. So I don't know if you kind of want to lead the discussion there, but so the framework is based on sort of five pillars or kind of 5 key principles that are recognized as sort of things that if they're addressed can help to reduce recidivism, and I would argue probably even help to, though not entirely eliminate, cut down on crime being committed in the first instance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't have my list in front of me. Let's see if we can remember them. So surely education is one, right?
Education
That's kind of a low-hanging fruit. Housing is one. Employment, positive social connections, and health, which health. Health is broad, but I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of that's about addictions. And I'm not sure what the situation is. And mental health, of course, which are cousins, right? They're not complete overlaps, but lots of times mental health drives addictions and addictions drives mental health, right? I'm not sure what the addiction sort of picture is in PI. I'll say that Saskatchewan, when it's come to addictions for the last, let's say 100 plus years, we've kind of lagged behind. There was a long time where if somebody had an addiction issue, there was nowhere to go. And then there was a while where there was private options out of province. And then I think there's been a few attempts at private options in province, but until very recently, if you had an addiction issue, we wish you luck, but you gotta try to sort it out. Kudos to the government. I will say here that apparently we're on a path to try to have 500 beds. I'm not actually sure how many we have right now, but I did hear a politician in the last year, 18 months, I forget who it was, but somewhere I remember hearing someone say that we're ahead of schedule, whatever that means. But the first step in a problem is you got to admit you have a problem, right? And I think we're there now, and next comes the resources, and we're working on that. So is 500 enough? I'm not quite sure, but at least there's some glimmer of hope that if you or a loved one has an addiction, that there's at least a list you can get on now. Yeah, so I'm not sure. Do you have any sense in PI? What's going on with addiction supports?
Yeah, it's pretty similar. We have one kind of provincial addiction treatment facility.
And it's really like a short-term option.
Yeah, it's a short-term option. It doesn't have that many beds. There's a pretty big wait list to get in. There are private options out of province, nothing on island. I think we've sort of historically been kind of the same as Saskatchewan. There's first, I think, been a real blind eye turned to just the extent of addiction issues. I think most people in PEI, probably until recently, would have thought that most of our addictions were more alcohol related, which maybe the short-term facility was a little bit better equipped to assist. You get people in, you dry them out. But, people, I think, are starting to open their eyes now to the real extent of the drug problem on PEI, which is pretty bad. I know I've seen statistics that at least kind of drug crime and drug arrests on PEI exceed the national average. There's been a lot of talk in government that things are going to be done and facilities are going to be built, but I haven't seen any real action. And the same with mental health. I think up until recently, and probably even still, I think there's maybe not a recognition of the real extent of the mental health issues that exist, and there's not much in the way of services to deal with it on PEI, and what services exist are pretty grossly underfunded.
Well, I think what we've seen as part of the work we're doing with homelessness and the pig count is that the intersection between homelessness, mental health, and substance use, which we already knew, is so clear that there's so much overlap, but that the systems don't speak to each other well. So you see a lot of that here around, okay, you've got an addiction problem, you can go here. You got a mental health problem, you can go here. And they've tried to put that under the same umbrella, but it still feels very segregated.
Well, it is, right. And you'll never solve just one piece of that problem, right? Like if somebody's got mental health and addiction issues, if you don't treat the mental health, the addiction will never get better. And if you don't treat the addiction, the mental health will never get better. And when you throw housing insecurity on top of that, if you don't deal with that too, then those other issues aren't going to improve.
You hit the nail on the head. This is the challenge. I always think we call it an alcohol problem or a drug problem, but actually, from the point of the user, it's actually an alcohol solution or a drug solution, right? That's not the problem. The problem is whatever that list of other things people have going on: mental health, education, housing, positive support networks. It's those things that are falling apart, and then people turn to escapism because of that. Not always, but oftentimes that's it. So you can't fix it without the recipe of supports. Like there's a recipe, sort of say, but there's a recipe, and a critical ingredient is addiction treatment. But that by itself doesn't do it. Again, you also need these other things like we talked about. Housing is a big one. Housing is fortunately not a new conversation. It's not that old of a conversation, actually, in the context of homelessness. Keep in mind that homelessness, as we know it in Canada, is a fairly new idea. There's always been people without a home, but as we know it today, the problem is fairly new. And unfortunately, the worrying part of it is the trajectory. Saskatoon just did a point in time count. There's 1,500 people living on the streets in Saskatoon.
Right.
And that was up from, I don't want to quote these numbers because I don't have them in front of me, but the last count a few years ago was something, I believe, less than half of that. And one before that would have been sort of that same, something half of that again. I'm not trying to be specific on the number, but again, 1,500 is a big number, but the trajectory is like, where is that going to top out? And the challenge for housing in Canada is housing wears two hats. The first, I would arguably, has to be the most important, is it's a home for people, but also in Canada, housing is an economic driver. In a lot of regions, actually everywhere, building new homes, buying new homes is sort of a key part of the economic growth. What's keeping the bubble or the balloon inflated, so to speak. So that makes housing inherently complicated. If housing was just about housing people, well, wouldn't we have it solved by now? Wouldn't we just have a house for everybody? But it's not that. It's also, again, it's got this important role in our economy that can't be denied. So we have different kind of forces at play with that. Education. I had a really neat opportunity last spring. Prince Albert Penitentiary. I asked to go see the inmate committee last spring. They had talked to us. Our board had done a tour, and they were starting a community garden. And John Howard had found a bit of money to help with this community garden. So I was going to go talk with the inmate committee and say, "Oh, good news! We found a bit of money for you guys to work in this garden." And when I got there, the guard I talked to said, "Oh, you're from John Howard." Okay. And she read over the loudspeaker, said, "Okay, John Howard's here. If you want to meet them in the gym, you can come." So I got to speak to a whole gym full of inmates, which was not what I went there that day to do, but it was really interesting. And I had a chance to kind of, explain what John Howard did, what our services were. And at the end, I had a chance to ask, like, okay, if you were in our position, what do you need? And you know what the resounding answer was? I'll tell you so you don't have to guess. Employment. People said, we're in here, we're able-bodied, we're clean. We want opportunities to work and learn, but we don't have them, and we leave, and we're broke and we're without skills, and then we stay broke. There's some harrowing stats about particularly federal offenders in Canada having access to work. Again, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say stats unless I can quote them. But I feel like I heard something through John Howard Ontario through their Fair Chances Coalition that something like, again, don't quote me on this, please, but it's like something like 70% of federal inmates have a hard time finding employment 10 years on. So something, again, if it's not a real stat, I shouldn't pretend that it is, but it's something like that. That I'll say the majority of offenders, particularly federal offenders, which again is over a 2-year sentence, they have a really hard time finding employment. So that's a really tricky one because how do you do it without money? Life's not all about money, but boy, money can help. A little bit of money can help a lot of problems go away. And there's a lot of problems that are just small problems, and without money, they all of a sudden become big problems. So, anyways, back to another pillar: employment. How do we make sure that people coming out of prison, while again in a Canadian context, prison is meant to be punishment, but how do we make sure that as people come out, that they have a chance to turn things around in employment? And employment education is like, again, one of those critical ingredients in a recipe to help reduce recidivism here. So,
well, absolutely. And it was kind of back to what you say, a lot of crime is driven by desperation. Well, there's very few people, especially those in our society today with the cost of living rising the way it is, who are more desperate than those who are unemployed and have no prospects for employment. So addressing that, especially for people coming out of custody is such a huge thing. And education, again, to say like education goes into that. I like education. I think that's such an important pillar. Because education can change not just the way you look at the world, but just like the way that you look at yourself as well, right? Like
sure.
It can increase people's perception of themselves and their self-esteem in such significant ways. So that's actually an area where we are having some luck here on PEI, where we've reached out to the correctional center and to some secondary and post-secondary institutions on PEI, and everyone's got some real good buy-in to provide distance education, like post-secondary education to inmates at the Provincial Correctional Center here. And so we're just kind of in the process of getting that up off the ground and running. But that's something that I'm really looking forward to for that purpose. And, getting people enrolled in school and in education and the kind of the transformative effects that can have on people's lives.
Excellent. And I have to give a little shout out here. I don't know if you've had Kristen from John Howard Ontario on yet. But
we didn't have her on. We had the folks who did the research project for employment and correction.
Okay, great. Well, John Howard Ontario has an excellent program running called the Fair Chances Coalition. They have a lovely website if anyone wants to check it out. And what they do is talk to employers about barriers for people coming out of corrections. And that might be as simple as, hey, if you have something on your website that says you need to have a criminal record check, you might need to have a criminal record check, and that's fair. Many jobs should have a criminal record check. But when some people see that, they might think, well, I have a criminal record, I should apply. When actually the criminal record they have has nothing that would limit them from. They might be an excellent candidate, there's nothing that would limit them from that job. So it might be as simple as talking to employers to say, hey, you need to adjust the wording on your job postings, all the way up to signing contracts actually with big employers. Maybe a home rental store or a chain of coffee shops or something like that. Say, well, why don't you guys think about hiring inmates? Because there's all these people coming out. And the stats also say that people that have had particularly a federal, they spent time in federal custody, they're actually quite loyal employees. When they find a job, they have better retention rates than the general population. So they're doing this great program in Ontario, Fair Chances Coalition, and it's something that I think we should have all across the country.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. And so as Josh said, we had 2 of their staff members who did a lot of the research into kind of the issues around employment and people incarceration. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting they talked about was that kind of, you talk about sort of having a criminal record, but it's kind of the more information about that criminal record that's given to employers, actually, the more likely they are to hire somebody to realize, oh, their criminal record is just for this, and it was, years ago, and they've done it. So, like, actually giving employers more information in that regard can make them more likely to hire people.
Interesting. Yeah, that would make sense to me. Huh.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you just about quickly here, Shawn, just because we're coming to the end of our time. Obviously, being a prairie province, Saskatchewan is a big First Nations community. How do you see the numbers kind of shaking out in terms of, your clientele coming out of the correctional institutions, homeless clientele? What proportion of that group is First Nations? And do you have any kind of First Nation specific programming with John Howard, Saskatchewan?
Excellent. I'm so glad you brought that up. That was on my mind for us to talk about, because I feel like a lot of people who maybe haven't worked in the prairies or been to the prairies maybe don't quite understand the extent of the colonial impact that's so fresh here. So in Saskatchewan, I think the last census I've seen, that's maybe a few years old, so this might have adjusted a bit, but in Saskatchewan, the general population of Indigenous people is around 16%, okay, which is actually much higher than many other areas of Canada, but still a minority population. When we look at those statistics about homelessness, about incarceration, about the youth and care system, all of those, the rates are about 80% Indigenous.
Wow.
In the case of female incarceration, I think the last stat I heard is around 90% of incarcerated women in Saskatchewan are Indigenous.
Wow.
So it's not something you have to like really stare at a long time to kind of draw the connection to the colonial system, past and present in Canada, and what's happening here. I think it's one thing that's important to remember, that this is an ancient history on the plains. Saskatchewan became a province in 1905. The population of Saskatchewan at that time was not many people, and now it's about 1 million, just over 1 million people. But we're not talking about something that was generations and generations and generations ago. There's people that I work with that the lifestyle that their grandparents were living, or even their parents, or even them in some cases, was pretty different than the one I grew up in as someone whose ancestors came from away. Yeah, so you can't really start to adjust any of these issues, whether it's homelessness and poverty, the youth and care system, or over incarceration of Indigenous people in jails, which happen, by the way, to be the three kind of pillars of the work we do here. I mentioned sort of the programming. That's what John Howard's right in the middle of, is youth and care, the incarceration system, and homelessness and poverty. You can't really start to unpack that without understanding the Indigenous element to that. I would say that there's many causes. At the heart of it, though, is two things. One is a cultural clash between Western capitalist culture and many Indigenous cultures across the plains and across North America, actually, Canada and North America, that had a lot of values that were at odds, right? Everything from economics to gender roles to roles of family. I picture sort of, I hate to use this as a visual, but I think of sort of Western culture as like a semi-truck, right? And a lot of cultures that Western cultures have come in and sort of come to dominate, they're a hatchback, and there's a crash, and Western culture just bowls people and cultures over, and I think we're just living in the aftermath of that crash, and again, it's not ancient, it's still fresh. The wound is still fresh. So to me, that's sort of at the heart of why these numbers are there, is that we have people that are still figuring out, not just people, but families and communities that are still figuring out what it means to live in this thing we live in, which is Western culture and Western economics. So that makes it challenging, because there's a lot to unpack in that. I'll also say that economic exclusion is part of it, that a lot of these people, policy-wise, certainly till recently, and some would argue still, that there's still economic exclusion for people. And back to what we were talking about with people coming out of prison, it's hard to make things work without money, is the reality here. You need supports, and money can make a lot of small problems stop from turning into big problems. And the reality is there's still a lot of barriers to employment for Indigenous people. That might relate to education, and sometimes it might relate to systemic or visible or invisible barriers for Indigenous people finding employment. I'll say that that's something we focused on at the John Howard Saskatchewan Society of Saskatchewan. I don't want to claim that we're doing a great job at it, because boy, there's way more work ahead of us than there's behind us. But we believe that more than 20, we've said 25, but the number fluctuates because we have people coming and going. But for sure, I would say more than 20% of our staff is Indigenous. So I think that's part of where the real work begins. Not to say it's enough, but that's part of where it starts, is that the people that work for you, you need to try your best to have them reflect society as a whole, at very least. Ideally, society that you're serving. Again, in our case, we're serving, in many of our programs, 80% or plus are Indigenous. The challenge with trying to have a goal of having 80% employees Indigenous, not to say it's not ambitious or achievable, or it's not like something to aspire to. The challenge is that the Indigenous people that, again, make up about 16% of our general population, not all of them want to work for us. Not all of them want to work in the nonprofit sector, and not all of them want to work for the John Howard Society or any organization, particular organization. But I think that's I think our role in helping decolonize what's going on here. That's one of the most important things we're able to do, is look at how can we engage people as employees, not just clients. So that's one thought. Another thought is that we hear, and I realize we're probably running out of time here, so thanks for hearing me out here. I'll wrap up. I think that we hear a lot of the bad side of the story, which we cannot turn a blind eye to. But some we don't hear often is actually the good thing that's happening, particularly in Saskatchewan and probably other communities across Canada for sure, when it comes particularly to Indigenous people. That we have First Nations University here in Regina. Beautiful, beautiful big building, beautiful space. And every year that university is graduating a class, a group of Indigenous people a graduating class to say, a group of Indigenous people that are ready to go out and kick butt.
Awesome.
Wow.
And some of those people will come and work at John Howard, and some of them will go work at a credit union, and some of them will be teachers, and some of them will be university profs, and many of them will be lawyers, actually. And every time that happens, every one of those people represents an individual, a family, a community that is going through that healing process of decolonizing and reconciliation. And so, yeah, I think I could talk about this for hours, so I know we got to wrap up, but just to say that the stats are harrowing, and I think other people need to understand that situation on the prairies. And also, we need to not lose sight of the fact that the healing is happening. I think if you got a cut on your arm, right? The first day it cut, it really hurts and it bleeds a lot. And then once you stop the bleeding, there's a scar and it hurts. And then once that eventually, the hurt stops and the scar's still there. And eventually you have a scar, but there's no scab or anything, And we're not quite there yet. And we should always know that there's always going to be a scar in Canada's colonial past. There's always going to be a scar there. But we're at such a time of healing right now. There's so much healing going on that I just have so much, part of what keeps me energized on a tough day is knowing that the Indigenous community in Saskatchewan and beyond, the next generation is going to have so much more opportunity than this generation. And one final point, I promise I will wrap it up with this. If anyone has any idea of how that change is going to happen, how it's happening is it's Indigenous people doing it. It's not John Howard Society that's making that change. We are doing, I think, important work to sort of be part of that reconciliation process, but it's not John Howard doing it for Indigenous people. It's not other nonprofits or the government doing it for Indigenous people. It's Indigenous people doing it for Indigenous people. And that's happening more and more every day. And just I would say, when it comes to Indigenous communities in Saskatchewan, watch out. There is so many communities that are doing great things and are just more and more ready to do great things. So just watch out. There's a future can be so bright.
And you know what, John? I think that's a great positive note to end on.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And it's a lot of interesting things to digest there about the way in which you're approaching the situation with Indigenous individuals. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot that we could take away from that and consider applying some of that here.
Absolutely. Sure. The same problems exist here. We're a smaller province, so maybe not on the same scale, but the same issues exist, and and they need to be dealt with, and similar approach needs to be taken to dealing with them. So I think there's a lot that we talked about today that we'll take away here and see what we can modify and apply in the PEI context.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, guys.
So much.
Yeah, I really appreciate the time, and just keep up that work. You guys need a halfway house, and just the work will never be done. But in the meantime, this is we got a short time here, and it's important to do what you can where you are with what you got. So just keep up the good work.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks. And you too.
Thanks, guys. Yeah. Take care.
Yeah. And so for everybody, for moving forward, you can find us on the John Howard Society of PEI YouTube channel, on our social media, and on our website.
That's right. Yeah, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Like us on Facebook. Check out our website. If anyone is interested in the work that the John Howard Society does, please reach out to us. If you're interested in volunteering or joining our board of directors, please reach out. We're always happy to hear from people and talk to people about the work that we do, and to involve people, engage people in the work that we do. And also, if anyone here is listening from a different province, check out your local John Howards. There are John Howards across Canada. They're all doing amazing work, and they're all, I'm sure, would be more than happy to have more people interested, engaged, and involved.
Yeah, and last reminder that John Howard Week will be coming up that first week of March, so keep an eye for that stuff.
Absolutely.
All right, take care, everybody, and have a great week.